There is a specific kind of silence that exists only in the homes of the obscenely wealthy. It's not a peaceful quiet. It's a heavy, pressurized void, thick with unspoken rules and the low, constant hum of hidden machinery maintaining a perfect 68-degree Fahrenheit climate. For 2 years, I was a part of that silence. My name is Chloe, and I was the nanny. I was the ghost in the gilded cage of Blackwood Manor. Before this, I had a different life. A life with a future I had carved out for myself. I was pre-med at Stanford, at the top of my class. But life has a cruel sense of humor, rerouting carefully laid plans into service elevators and back staircases. My parents, both kind, middle-class school teachers, were killed by a drunk driver in a crash that was as sudden as it was senseless. It left me with nothing but a mountain of their remaining debts and my own university fees. The dream of becoming a doctor evaporated overnight. I needed a job that provided room and board, and a salary large enough to keep the collectors at bay. The Blackwoods were old money, a term that doesn't do their level of wealth justice. Their money wasn't just spent, it was a foundational layer of the universe, as constant as gravity. Alistair Blackwood, the patriarch, was a man who looked like he'd been carved from a single block of granite and expensive suits. He spoke in low, deliberate tones, and every word felt like a verdict. His wife, Eleanor, was his perfect counterpart, a collection of sharp, elegant angles, coldly beautiful, her emotions kept locked away tighter than the diamonds in the safe. Their world was one of curated, icy perfection, and I was hired to maintain one small, vital part of it, their 7-year-old daughter, Lily. Lily was the only real, warm, breathing thing in that entire, cold mausoleum. She had her mother's large, sapphire-blue eyes, but where Eleanor's were calculating and distant, Lily's were wide pools of gentle wonder and quiet intelligence. She was bookish, shy, and clung to me with the desperate grip of a child, starved for genuine, consistent affection. Her mother was a phantom presence, always en route to a charity gala, a spa retreat in Switzerland, or a shopping weekend in Milan. Trips I soon suspected were elaborate covers for her various discreet affairs. Her father was a ghost in his own right, a formidable presence only at the formal, silent dinners where he would interrogate his son, Julian, about quarterly reports and market shares. And then there was Julian, the heir, the prince of this frozen kingdom. He was everything you'd expect, impeccably dressed in tailoring that cost more than my car, Harvard-educated, groomed from birth to take over the Blackwood conglomerate. But unlike his parents, there was a humanity in him that hadn't been completely extinguished. A weariness around his kind, hazel eyes that his polished, society-page smile couldn't quite erase. He was the only one in that house who ever truly saw me. Not as staff, not as part of the furniture, but as Chloe. He'd ask me how my day was and actually listen to the answer. He remembered, offhandedly, that I preferred my tea with a spoonful of local honey, not the refined white sugar from the ornate silver bowl on the table. Once, he saw me reading a medical textbook in the library and spent 20 minutes asking me thoughtful questions about cardiology. In a world of polished, cold surfaces, his attention was a dangerous, warm flame, and I, isolated and lonely, was a moth drawn helplessly to it. I was meticulously careful. I was relentlessly professional. I kept my head down, my heart locked away, and my focus entirely on Lily. She was my responsibility and my solace. The catalyst came on a night when a violent spring storm lashed against the manor's leaded glass windows. The wind howled like a tormented spirit, and thunderclaps boomed, shaking the very foundations of the ancient house. Lily was terrified. I settled her in the vast, dark-paneled library, the one room that held a whisper of warmth with its smell of old leather, beeswax, and paper. We curled up in a large, worn velvet armchair by the fireplace, and I read to her from the secret garden, giving Mary Lennox a proper Yorkshire accent and bringing Dickon to life with a cheerful lilt. For a little while, the fury of the storm outside faded away. I didn't hear him come in. I just looked up from the page, and Julian was there, leaning against the doorframe, watching us. He was still in his work clothes, but his tie was loosened, and he held a crystal tumbler of amber whiskey. He wasn't drunk in a sloppy way, but there was a profound, melancholic air about him. He didn't say a word. He just walked in and sank into the wingback chair opposite us, closing his eyes and simply listening as I gave voice to the story. He stayed there, a silent, brooding presence, until Lily's breathing evened out and she fell into a deep, peaceful sleep against my chest. I carefully gathered her small, warm weight in my arms, her head heavy on my shoulder. Julian said to him, "You're so good with her, better than anyone ever has been." I just nodded, my throat suddenly too tight for words, and carried my sleeping charge up the grand staircase to her room, tucking her in and kissing her forehead. When I returned to the library to turn off the lamps, he was still there, staring into the dying embers of the fire as if they held the answers to all his unspoken questions. Julian said, "This family, it's a beautiful cage, Chloe, all this stuff asterisk, this legacy, and it's all so profoundly empty. You're the only real thing in it." He looked at me then, and the air in the room became charged, thick with a tension I had both craved and feared. He stood up, a little unsteady on his feet, and closed the small distance between us. He smelled of expensive scotch and a deep, profound loneliness that mirrored my own. Julian called me Chloe. And then he kissed me. It wasn't a command from the master of the house. It wasn't a casual assault. It was a question, a desperate, lonely plea from one isolated soul to another. And against every rule in the Nanny handbook, against every shred of my better judgment, and with my entire career and livelihood hanging in the balance, I answered. I kissed him back. It was my first, cataclysmic mistake, allowing the ghost to be seen, to be felt. The next morning, the storm had passed, leaving a clean, washed world outside. But inside the manor, a different, more dangerous tempest was brewing. Julian found me in the sun-drenched morning room, setting out Lily's breakfast. His eyes were clear, the previous night's sadness replaced by a determined, almost feverish light. Julian told me last night wasn't a mistake. It was the first real, honest thing I've done in years. I'm going to tell them, today. My blood ran cold. A wave of pure, undiluted panic washed over me. "Chloe," I said, "tell them." "Julian, no, you can't. I'll lose my job, your mother, she'll." Julian then said, "I don't care what they allow. I'm 28 years old, for God's sake. I'm not my father. I choose you, Chloe. I'm in love with you." He said it with such unshakable, foolish conviction. He was a prince who genuinely believed he could rewrite the story, blind to the ironclad rules of his dynasty. I was the commoner who knew, with chilling certainty, how these stories always ended for people like me. He didn't tell them that day. He bided his time, waiting for what he called a strategic moment. That moment arrived a week later at a formal family dinner. I was serving the main course, my hands trembling so violently I was terrified I'd drop the heavy, sterling silver platter. I placed a delicate porcelain plate before a leaner Blackwood, her sharp, hawk-like eyes missing nothing. Julian, seated to her right, cleared his throat. The sound echoed in the tense, silent dining room. Julian said, "Mother, Father, there's something I need to tell you. Chloe and I are in a relationship, a serious one. I intend to marry her." The silence that followed was so profound and heavy I could hear the ticking of the Breguet grandfather clock in the hall from 3 rooms away. Alistair Blackwood slowly, deliberately, placed his fork down on his plate. The click of silver on china was as loud and final as a gunshot. Alistair said with his voice low, "Dangerous rumble, you will do no such thing. You are the heir to the Blackwood fortune. You will marry a woman of your own standing, a woman from an appropriate family, not the help asterisk." The word was a physical blow, a deliberate, contemptuous slap. It stripped me bare, reducing 2 years of devoted care, of love for their daughter, of my own identity and crushed dreams, to a single, vile syllable. I felt my face flame with a potent mixture of shame and scalding fury. Julian responded, "I don't care about the fortune. I love her." Then Alina, his mom, her voice was like shattering crystal, each word a sharp fragment. She said, "Love. Don't be melodramatic, Julian. You're infatuated. She's a pretty, convenient face who's been kind to you. She's a gold digger, plain and simple. Can't you see that? She's been manipulating you, preying on your sentimental nature. It's what her kind does." I couldn't breathe. They were both looking directly at me now, their gazes like surgical scalpels, dissecting me, seeing only a scheming, social climbing servant, a parasite in their perfect world. Then I said that's not true. I would never. I love Lily. Alistair said you're fired. Effective immediately. You will pack your things and you will be off the premises within the hour. If you ever attempt to contact my son or my daughter again, I will ensure you are unemployable in this city. I will ruin what's left of your pathetic life. Julian was on his feet, shouting, his face contorted with a rage and helplessness I'd never seen. But his parents were an impenetrable fortress of will, tradition, and cold power. It was like watching a wave crash against a granite cliff. It changed nothing. I was escorted to my small room in the servants' wing by the stone-faced head of security. As I threw my few, humble belongings into a single, worn suitcase, I heard Eleanor's voice, cold and clear as ice, from the hallway, talking to her son. Eleanor, his mother, said she was just the nanny, Julian. A passing fancy. We'll find you a proper wife. You'll forget all about this in a month. I was marched out of the manor, my suitcase in hand, and unceremoniously deposited on the gravel driveway. The massive, iron-gated door swung shut behind me with a final, resonant thud that sounded like the end of the world. I was alone in the cold dark, with a single month's severance pay and a heart that felt like it had been shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces. I thought that was the end of my story. The tragic, cliched tale of the foolish nanny who fell in love with the prince and was cast out by the cruel king and queen. I was wrong. It was only the prologue. The Blackwoods had made a critical, arrogant error. They thought because they couldn't see my value, I had no power. They thought throwing me out was the end of the matter. They were about to learn that even ghosts can learn to fight back, and my revenge would not be one of petty destruction, but of magnificent creation. I would build a kingdom of my own, one they could never tear down, and I would make them watch. Scene end. Chapter 2, The Phoenix. Word count, 3,000. Scene start. EXD, Hope House Women's Shelter, night. The city, which had always seemed so bright from the windows of Blackwood Manor, was a terrifying, indifferent monster from the sidewalk. The severance pay bought me 1 week in a motel that reeked of mildew and despair. After that, I found myself at Hope House, a women's shelter, holding my suitcase and the tattered remains of my pride. The first night, I cried silent, heaving sobs into a thin, scratchy pillow, the sounds of the city and other broken lives a constant, haunting chorus. The shame was a physical weight. But as the sun rose, painting the dirty window pane in shades of gray and gold, a different emotion began to burn through the despair. A cold, hard, unyielding fury. The Blackwoods had called me a gold digger. They had reduced me to my job title. They thought my worth was defined by my bank statement. I would show them. I would become so successful, so powerful on my own terms, that my name would make theirs look like a footnote. But I had a secret that would become my ultimate weapon, my reason for breathing. I was pregnant. The discovery, 2 weeks after my eviction, sent me to my knees in the shared bathroom of the shelter. It wasn't just fear. It was a terrifying, overwhelming sense of responsibility. I was now fighting for two. I got a job as a waitress. The hours were long, the pay was meager, and my feet ached constantly. But it was honest work. On my breaks and late into the night, I studied. Medicine was no longer an option. The time and cost were prohibitive. But I had another skill, one I'd honed out of necessity: resourcefulness. I devoured books on business, marketing, and e-commerce from the public library. I taught myself how to code a basic website, how to manage social media, how to understand supply chains. My son, Leo, was born in the same public hospital where I worked as a receptionist, a job I'd managed to get for the health insurance. He was small and perfect, with a dusting of fair hair and Julian's hazel eyes. Looking into his tiny, trusting face, my vow solidified into an unbreakable oath. He would never know this struggle. He would never be made to feel less than. He was a Blackwood by blood, and he would have his birthright, but it would be delivered to him on a platter of my own making, not begged for from his grandparents. The idea for my business came from Leo. The cheap, mass-produced baby products I could afford were full of chemicals and poorly made. I remembered the simple, pure things I'd wanted for Lily: organic cotton, natural wooden toys, safe, non-toxic lotions made from simple ingredients. A market gap yawned wide open before me. I started Leo's Garden on a rickety laptop at my kitchen table. The name was a declaration, something living and growing, the antithesis of the Blackwoods' cold, sterile world. I sourced organic cotton for onesies from a small farm I found online. I learned to make a gentle, chamomile and lavender baby balm from a recipe I perfected through endless, late-night experimentation. My apartment smelled like a herb garden and hard work. I sold my first batch of onesies and balm on a fledgling e-commerce platform. Then I sold 10, then 100. A mommy blogger found my products and wrote a glowing review. The orders started to trickle, then to flow. I reinvested every single cent, moving from my kitchen table to a small storage unit, then to a tiny, one-room warehouse. For 5 years, my life was a grueling, beautiful blur of work and motherhood. I was CEO, packer, shipper, and customer service representative. I was also mom, the storyteller, the boo-boo kisser, the champion. I was running on caffeine and sheer willpower, but with every sale, with every happy customer review, I could feel myself getting stronger. I was no longer Chloe the nanny. I was Chloe Sterling, founder and CEO. I was building my own empire brick by brick, with my son by my side. I never contacted Julian. I knew his parents monitored him, and I would not give them the satisfaction of seeing me struggle. I was a ghost, but I was gathering strength, becoming a force they wouldn't see coming. Leo was the heir to a throne I was building with my own hands, and the time was coming to claim his rightful place in the dynasty that had rejected him. 5 years to the day after I was thrown out of Blackwood Manor, I stood in the bright, open-plan office of Leo's Garden, now a thriving multi-million-dollar company. We occupied 2 floors of a stylish building in a trendy part of the city. The air smelled of coffee, creativity, and the faint, comforting scent of lavender from our signature balm. Through the glass walls of my corner office, I could see my team, my dedicated, brilliant team that I had hired and nurtured, working diligently. On my desk was a framed photo of Leo, now a vibrant, curious 5-year-old with his father's smile. Next to it was a financial newspaper, folded to a specific page. The headline read, "Blackwood Conglomerate reports 3rd consecutive quarter of losses. Is the legacy brand losing its relevance?" A slow, satisfied smile touched my lips. I had been waiting for this. I had monitored their decline from afar. Their old-world, ruthless business model was failing. They were too slow, too arrogant, too out of touch with the modern consumer who valued sustainability and ethics, the very principles I had built my company upon. My head of finance, Sarah, a sharp woman in her 40s who had believed in my vision when it was just a PowerPoint presentation, stood before my desk. Sarah said, "The numbers are solid, Chloe. We're in a position to be aggressive. Our green thumb venture capital arm has been quietly buying up their short-term debt. Through the various shell companies, we are now effectively their largest creditor." This was it, the moment the ghost stepped out of the shadows. Then I responded, "Good. Set up a meeting with Alistair and a leaner Blackwood. Tell them it's regarding a potential partnership to revitalize their brand." The meeting was held in the very same Blackwood conglomerate boardroom where I had once served coffee. The irony was so thick I could taste it. I walked in, not in a nanny's uniform, but in a custom-tailored navy blue power suit. My hair was styled in a sophisticated cut, and I carried a leather portfolio that contained not serving plans, but the blueprint for their surrender. Alistair and a leaner were already there, seated at the head of the long, polished table. They looked older, wearier, the lines on their faces etched deeper by stress and failure. But their eyes still held that same cold arrogance. They did not recognize me. To them, I was just another supplicant, Chloe Sterling, the founder of that trendy baby company. Alistair said to me, "Mrs. Sterling, we're very busy. You have 10 minutes to explain why we should partner with a niche maternal brand." His condescension was a similar bitter tonic. Then I responded, "This isn't a partnership proposal, Mr. Blackwood. It's a choice." I slid a single document across the gleaming table. It was a summary of their debt, highlighting the portions owned by my shell companies. Then I said, "You have 90 days of operating capital left. Maybe I am your primary creditor. You can accept my terms for a restructuring, which includes ceding controlling interest to me, or I call in these notes tomorrow, and you can explain to your shareholders why Blackwood Conglomerate is filing for Chapter 11. Eleanor's hand flew to her throat. Alistair's face turned a dangerous shade of purple. The mask of icy composure shattered. Eleanor said to me, This is extortion. Then I responded, "It's business, Mrs. Blackwood. The kind your husband taught me, survival of the fittest." I stood up, looking down at them from the head of the table, a position they were no longer fit to hold. Then I told them, "You have 24 hours to decide. My assistant will be in touch." I turned and walked out, leaving them in stunned, furious silence. The ghost had returned, and she had just declared war. My next move was Julian. I knew he was running their faltering innovation division, a token title with no real power or budget. I requested a meeting with him, professionally, under the guise of discussing synergies. Walking into his office was like stepping back in time. He looked tired, burdened, the light in his eyes I remembered dimmed by years of fighting a losing battle against his parents' stagnation. He looked up as I entered, and for a moment there was no recognition. Then his eyes widened. He stood up slowly, his jaw slack. Julian said to me, "Chloe, my God, is it really you?" Then I responded, "Hello, Julian." The years fell away in that single look. All the pain, the love, the betrayal. I saw the same man I had fallen in love with, trapped in a gilded cage of his own making. Julian said to me, "I looked for you, for months. My parents, they had you erased, I thought I'd never see you again." His voice was raw with emotion. Then I responded, "They tried, but I'm harder to get rid of than that." Then I showed him the photo on my phone. A picture of Leo, laughing on a swing, his hazel eyes sparkling in the sun. I said, "His name is Leo. He's 5. Julian stared at the picture, his face a torrent of conflicting emotions: shock, wonder, joy, and a deep, gut-wrenching anguish. Then he asked, my son." I nodded. He sank back into his chair, his hands trembling as he took the phone. Julian said, "All this time, I have a son." That was the moment our alliance was forged, not just as former lovers, but as partners. He had never stopped loving me, and the discovery of Leo ignited a fire in him I hadn't seen since the night in the library. He was done living under his parents' thumb. We would take back his company, his future, and secure our son's legacy together. Over the next few months, from the inside, Julian fed me information. I learned of Eleanor's pet projects, charities she used as personal slush funds, siphoning money to support her extravagant lifestyle. I discovered Alistair's shady backroom deals with foreign contractors, deals that skirted ethics and legality. We gathered our ammunition meticulously. The final board meeting was the battlefield. Alistair, desperate and cornered, was trying to rally the old guard board members to vote me out, to take out a catastrophic loan to pay me off. He stood at the head of the table, his voice trembling with rage, pointing a finger at me. He said, This opportunist asterisk is trying to steal your company. She's a snake. We cannot let this happen." I let him finish his tirade. Then I stood. I placed a copy of the debt summary in front of every board member. My name is not just Chloe Sterling. It is Chloe Blackwood. Julian and I were married in a private ceremony last week. The room erupted in gasps. I took Julian's hand, and he stood beside me, his expression resolute. That was how I pay back the humiliation I suffered from them, and the pain of raising my son all alone for 5 years. I, Julian, and my son Leo live happy together, while Julian's parents were left to suffer the consequence of their action by looking down on me as a maid I was then unfit for their son.